So today I'm going to be talking about the role of the Ob-Gyn Physician in caring for asylum seekers. I have no financial interest to disclose. So I'll start with some background. I'm going to talk about the definitions of refugee and asylum seeker. I'll talk about the scope of the problem in terms of global displacement, both globally and locally. I'll go through a brief overview of asylum law, and then we'll talk about the role of the Ob-Gyn physician. So specifically, I'll address challenges in healthcare faced by refugees and how physicians can provide trauma-sensitive care for refugee women. I'll talk about how physicians can assist applicants in the asylum process by providing medical and psychological evaluations to support their asylum claim, and then I'll talk about how you can get involved. Okay. So before we go further, I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page in terms of the definition of a refugee and an asylum seeker. The international definition of a refugee, as defined by the United Nations, is a person who has fled his or her country of nationality and is unable or unwilling to return because of a well-founded fear of persecution on account of race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group. Asylum, on the other hand, is legal protection that's granted to foreign nationals already in the United States or at a port of entry who meet the definition of a refugee. So this is the right to be recognized as a refugee and receive legal protection and material assistance, including protection from being returned to the person's home country where they may be persecuted. And a key difference here is that applicants for refugee status are living outside the United States, whereas applicants seeking asylum are in the United States or arriving at a U.S. port of entry. The world is currently experiencing the highest levels of displacement on record. This is data from the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. It was updated as of June 2018. There are 68.5 million people around the world who have been forced from their home as a result of conflict, persecution, or generalized violence. That's one person every 2 seconds. Among them are 2.5 million refugees, over half of whom are under the age of 18. And there are 3.1 million asylum seekers globally. This is also data from the UN Refugee Agency, and it shows the distribution globally of refugees. 2/3 of all refugees worldwide come from just 5 countries: Syria, Afghanistan, South Sudan, Myanmar, and Somalia. And you'll notice that countries in developing regions host the vast majority of the world's refugees. So about 85% of all refugees at the end of 2017 were granted protection in developing countries. Many of these countries just simply don't have the infrastructure or the resources to support the influx of people, and it's particularly challenging for them to be able to mobilize sufficient resources to care for these refugees. And then here's the global distribution of asylum seekers. You'll notice the US, Germany, Turkey, Italy, and South Africa host a large number of asylum seekers. This is data from the US Department of Homeland Security. The most recent data they report is from 2016. A total of almost 85,000 people were admitted to the United States as refugees in 2016. The leading country of nationalities for refugees admitted during this time period were the Democratic Republic of Congo, Syria, Burma, Iraq, and Somalia. And during 2016, over 20,000 individuals were granted asylum. This map shows the per capita refugee resettlement by state, and you'll see that Wisconsin is in the middle at 16 to 25 per 100,000 of state population. This is also data from the U.S. Department of State. Between 2002 and 2016, 14,000 refugees resettled in Wisconsin. This places Wisconsin at the 24th position for refugee resettlement in a ranking of 54 U.S. states and territories. Over the past 15 years, refugees from 36 different countries have resettled in Wisconsin. The largest nation of origin by far has been Myanmar, followed by Laos, Somalia, and Iraq. And then this is resettlement by city during that same time period. So Milwaukee, unsurprisingly, has by far the largest population of refugees, and Madison comes in 3rd with close to 800 resettled refugees. Does anybody here know anything about asylum law? So I'm going to talk just briefly about the history of refugee resettlement in the U.S. The basis of our current law comes out of the mass displacement that happened during World War II. So in the United States, a law called the Displaced Persons Act was passed in 1948 to address the migration crisis in Europe, where millions of people had been forcibly displaced from their homes. Also in 1948, the United Nations passed a Declaration of Human Rights that recognized asylum as a method for immigrants to escape persecution in their home countries. In 1951, the UN adopted a convention relating to the status of refugees, which recognized the right of individuals to seek asylum from persecution in other countries. It established an international legal definition of a refugee, which is a definition that we talked about, and set up guidelines for the protection of refugees. The convention was amended in the form of a protocol in 1967, which essentially just broadened the scope of the protocol to be applicable beyond World War II. The United States was a signatory to this protocol, which gave the US a legal obligation to provide protection for those who qualify as refugees, and also prohibits the US from returning a refugee to a country where his or her life or freedom will likely be threatened. The foundation for much of our current law comes from the Refugee Act of 1980. This was a bipartisan act that was passed unanimously by the Senate and signed into law by then President Jimmy Carter. It set up a systematic way to admit refugees into the U.S., either from abroad as resettled refugees or in the U.S. as asylum seekers. It also raised the annual ceiling for refugees and then created a process for reviewing and revising that ceiling to meet emergencies. And it also brought the U.S. into U.S. law in a greater accord with obligations under the United Nations Protocol. Since 1980, there have been a number of laws that have made it more difficult to get asylum. The Illegal Immigrant Reform and Responsibility Act was passed in 1996. This was an effort by Congress to strengthen immigration laws and introduce restrictions for those who present illegally at the U.S. border. And then the Real ID Act was introduced in 2005, and this implemented further restrictions. It implemented some statutory bars to asylum and a greater burden of proof for applicants. So as mentioned earlier, U.S. law establishes two paths for refugee protection. So with resettlement, a person typically flees to a neighboring country and then applies for asylum applies for refugee status from abroad. So refugees are granted permission to stay in the U.S. before they arrive, and then they're given some sort of support when they get here. This is a process that's run by the UN High Commissioner for Refugees and the U.S. State Department. Asylum is the second path. So to be eligible for asylum, an individual has to be either on U.S. soil or arriving at a port of entry. So there's three common scenarios. Either somebody arrives at a port of entry and requests asylum, they enter the country without inspection and then they apply once they're inside the U.S., or they enter with a valid visa and then apply either before or after the visa expires. So to be eligible for asylum, a person has to meet the definition of a refugee. And then if we break down that definition a little further, individuals have to demonstrate a well-founded fear of persecution in their home countries. So persecution is defined quite broadly. This can include threats to life, confinement, detention, or imprisonment, torture, rape or sexual assault, forced abortion or sterilization, female genital mutilation, coercive medical treatment, or severe discrimination. And the key here is that to be eligible for asylum, the persecution has to be targeted to the individual. So this is not generalized harm that comes out of civil strife or the insecurities of war. This is persecution that is targeted specifically to the individual. And it also has to be either inflicted by the government or in a situation where the government is either unwilling or unable to provide protection. So an example would be somebody who speaks out against corruption in their government and then is subsequently imprisoned and tortured by their government. Or a woman who experiences domestic violence and then goes to the police and the police don't respond to their claims. And then finally, the individual has to demonstrate that they would face persecution if they were returned to their home countries. Typically, establishing past persecution raises a presumption of future persecution. The exception would be if there's changed circumstances, like the country gets a new government or something happens that the person can internally relocate within their country and be safe from persecution. And then an asylee also has to demonstrate that they've been persecuted on the basis of these 5 protected grounds. So those include race, nationality, religion, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group. And membership in a particular social group is the most sort of nebulous ground for asylum, and it's also typically the ground that's most relevant for women's health. So there's been a trend over the past decade and a half or so towards identifying gender as a particular social group, since women experience human rights abuses that are particular to their gender. So this has opened the door for women to seek asylum in the United States in cases such as domestic violence, rape, female genital mutilation, child and forced marriage, bride burning, trafficking, LGBT issues, forced sterilization and abortion, and honor killing. Currently, the Trump administration has placed some restrictions on domestic violence and gang violence for individuals who present at the border. And then during an asylum case, the burden of proof is placed on the applicant. So applicants have to produce corroborative evidence that proves their eligibility for asylum. So this is typically done, the applicant submits testimony, usually in the form of a legal affidavit that details what happened to them, testimony of witnesses, medical records that document trauma, birth certificates, police reports, and then particularly relevant to us, medical legal affidavits, which are legal documents that are submitted by physicians that detail the physical and psychological sequelae of the treatment. And this is something I'll go into in detail later in the presentation. There are certain statutory bars to asylum. There's a one-year filing rule. So this was enacted in 1896 as part of more restrictive laws around asylum. It just says that applicants have to apply within 1 year of the day that they arrive in the United States. So exceptions would be extraordinary circumstances like serious illness, mental or physical disability, or effects related to the persecution they've suffered. And many of those who work with asylum seekers feel like this is a really trauma-ignorant law because it prevents people with legitimate claims from obtaining protection when their filings were delayed because of fear or a lack of information or other circumstances beyond their control. And then individuals are not eligible for asylum if they've been resettled or have asylum in another country, if they've had a previous denial by the U.S., illegal re-entry after a previous deportation, or if they've been convicted of certain crimes, or there's also some terrorism bars. So individuals can apply for asylum either affirmatively or defensively. Affirmative application is preferred. This is an application that's run by the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. And individuals are eligible if they're either in the U.S. legally or if they're in the U.S. without documentation, but they haven't been apprehended and charged as an illegal immigrant. So basically they come forward to the government and say, I've been persecuted, I want to apply for asylum. So this involves an interview with an asylum officer, so it's non-confrontational, there's no court hearing. And the outcome is either one of two things. Either the person is granted asylum or they're not granted asylum. And if they're not granted, then they're placed in removal proceedings through immigration court. Individuals who apply defensively are those who have been apprehended by immigration or denied asylum following an affirmative application. So this takes place in immigration court with a judge and an ICE prosecutor. They can have an attorney, but one is not provided by the U.S. government. So with a criminal investigation, the defendant has a right to legal representation by an attorney, but because this doesn't take place in the criminal court system, individuals don't have a right to an attorney at government expense. So there are many attorneys and organizations that provide pro bono legal representation, and then some applicants, if they're able to do so, pay for services. If you're granted asylum, great, and then if the individual is denied, then they're deported. So for those who are granted asylum, they're safe from deportation. They're eligible for social assistance, so things like food stamps and Medicaid. Their immediate family can be granted permission to migrate to the U.S., which is huge in terms of reuniting people with their spouses and their children. They can work, so you can apply for permission within 180 days of filing for asylum. And then there's a path to citizenship. So you can, an individual can apply for legal permanent residence after a year and then can naturalize after 5 years. This is data from 1990 to 2016, and it shows the trend in terms of the number of individuals granted asylum in the U.S. So in 2016, there were just over 20,000 individuals granted asylum. There are a number of other forms of humanitarian relief that I won't get into here, but just briefly, two that are particularly relevant to us as Ob-Gyns are the T visa or trafficking visa, and this provides protection for victims of human trafficking. So the expectation is that these individuals comply with reasonable requests from law enforcement for assistance in investigating or prosecuting traffickers. And then there's also the Violence Against Women Act. This was introduced by then Senator Joe Biden and signed into law in 1994. The law provides legal safeguards for immigrant victims of domestic violence. And the law basically acknowledges that domestic violence is a public health policy and human rights concern, and it created a pathway for battered immigrants to obtain legal status without dependency on their abusive partners. So refugee women face a unique set of challenges both in their country of origin and on arrival to the U.S. And I'm going to spend the rest of the presentation talking about these challenges and the ways that OB-GYNs can care for and advocate for these women. So women are particularly vulnerable in the face of conflict. Conditions during their migration often involve limited nutrition, hygiene, and sanitation and exposure to infectious disease. Once in refugee camps, there's often limited access to health care. This leads to neglected chronic health conditions, anemia, dental issues, vitamin deficiencies, parasites, hepatitis, HIV infection, and untreated abnormal cervical cytology. Women are vulnerable to forced kidnappings. The prevalence of sexual violence among women is also often high. Rape as a weapon of war has historically been used in military and government tactics in certain conflicts. Fear of sexual assault often impacts the woman's basic economic survival, since women are afraid to leave protected areas to collect food or water or tend to crops. They often suffer a lack of protection from governments and local authorities because gender-based violence is tolerated, ignored, or unrecognized. Often women also have no recourse to address crimes that are committed against them. Abused women are sometimes ostracized by their families and communities. And then women also often report experiences of childhood, sexual and physical abuse, and domestic violence long before they even became refugees. Okay. So once they arrive in the U.S., refugee women face an overwhelming set of challenges. Many refugees and asylum seekers have lasting physical and psychological sequelae of war, deprivation, persecution, and torture. A 2015 meta-analysis suggests that up to 44% of all refugees and asylees have been tortured. Rape was reported in almost a third of female torture survivors. Refugees may also experience other abuses, including concussive trauma, witnessing torture and executions, cutting, asphyxiation, and electric shock. There is a high prevalence of mental health disorders. PTSD, depression, and anxiety are the most commonly reported mental health issues for refugee women, and studies have shown clinically significant rates of these mental health disorders as high as 80+%. The risk for mental health disorders continues for years and can be related both to the trauma that they've experienced and also factors related to their resettlement. Often a patient's psychiatric symptoms can wax and wane depending on other life stressors, and it's not uncommon for torture-related symptoms to recur even decades following the initial trauma. Some survivors of torture and abuse have scars or visible deformities, but even without ongoing physical concerns, many refugees suffer from debilitating chronic pain. There was a study of refugee torture survivors in the UK that showed that 78% reported persistent multiple pain symptoms, mostly in the head and lower back. So physicians play an important role in providing support related to mental health concerns. It's important to recognize that trauma often has a chronic nature and can recur even years after a traumatic event. It's also important to understand cross-cultural responses to trauma, so recognizing that the way we conceptualize mental health and mental health disorders in the US can be different in other countries and cultures. So there's this concept of a culturally responsive diagnosis, which involves the ability to identify the differences in the manifestations of psychological symptoms cross-culturally. It's important to take trauma histories, record the relevant details, and then integrate them into patients' care. I think there's a common fear from clinicians that they'll re-traumatize patients by asking them to relive their experiences. And this is certainly something to consider, but data has also shown that having a lack of awareness of a patient's history actually has a potential for even greater re-traumatization. So the medical setting is a trigger for many patients. This leads some survivors of abuse to either not seek medical care or lead to a lack of follow-through with appointments. And awareness of a patient's history can help physicians understand a patient's symptoms, anticipate and hopefully prevent re-traumatization, and then troubleshoot barriers to adherence. It's also important for physicians to have education in trauma-based interviewing, which includes techniques to take a history in a way that minimizes re-traumatization. And then finally, having sensitivity in the gynecological exam that's intrusive by nature. And especially for these women, it's important to have a sense of patient control. And this is something that applies broadly to all of our patients with a history of sexual violence, and something that I know we're all used to dealing with in our practice. Refugees sometimes have ongoing physical injuries related to their trauma. Underdeveloped or eroding healthcare systems in their home countries can leave refugees with poorly controlled or undiagnosed chronic medical conditions. Refugees are significantly less likely to engage in preventative medicine and primary healthcare services. So according to a study that was published a few years ago, only about half of immigrant women at risk for unintended pregnancy receive contraceptive care in the last year, as opposed to 2/3 of US-born women. Immigrant women have higher rates of unintended pregnancy. They're also less likely to receive cervical cancer screening, and they have higher rates of cervical cancer-related deaths. Once women arrive in the United States, they continue to be very vulnerable to gender-based violence. These women often lack protection from women's rights abuses in their home countries, and they often continue to not seek help from law enforcement once they're in the U.S. So it's important for physicians to have high clinical suspicion for chronic medical conditions, to provide contraceptive and screening services, and screening for infectious disease. If individuals come into the U.S. as refugees, infectious disease screening occurs on arrival, but if people come into the country as asylum seekers, they may not have had any screening. And then screening for gender-based violence. Language is often a barrier. Refugee women are less likely than refugee men to speak English or to be literate, and they may be from cultures where the man is traditionally the spokesperson, so these factors can interfere with their care in the U.S. There's often a lack of health literacy, so particularly within the U.S. healthcare system. So routine things like filling a prescription, for example, can be confusing if somebody doesn't know what to do with the prescription, where to go to the pharmacy, how to manage refills. And not understanding the system can make utilization of services less likely. Refugee women have unique competing concerns, often priorities like reestablishing family and safety and integration, finances, housing, transportation, and social adjustments trump medical care. The process of resettlement itself is stressful and time-consuming. Refugees experience changes in their social status and identity, separation from family and friends, and changes in their social and daily rituals. Refugees and asylum seekers sometimes struggle with discrimination and social exclusion after they enter the U.S. During focus groups interviews, asylum seekers have reported marginalization associated with their race, ethnicity, and religion. Immigrants are sometimes accused of taking advantage of the U.S. or engaging in terrorist activities. And asylum seekers can also be excluded by members of their own communities living in the U.S. due to stigma related to surviving sexual exploitation or prejudice against LGBT individuals, which is a common reason to seek asylum in the U.S. So in the healthcare setting, it's helpful to have bilingual health educators, case managers, patient navigators, and vetted female interpreters to address competing concerns like housing stability and finances, and then address discrimination and the impact of patient health and behaviors. So it's important to identify safety strategies for patients and advocacy programs that can support targeted communities. A huge barrier to medical care is lack of insurance. Unauthorized immigrants are excluded from benefits provided under the Affordable Care Act. These barriers to access result in refugees receiving fewer preventative healthcare services, including prenatal care and poor reproductive health outcomes. There are exceptions, including Medicaid payment for emergency services in some situations. Since 2002, states have also had the option to provide prenatal care to women regardless of their immigration status. There are also state and locally funded healthcare programs that provide coverage to some groups of immigrants regardless of their immigration status. Lawfully present immigrants may qualify for Medicaid, but they're subject to certain restrictions. So many qualified non-citizens, like green card holders, have a 5-year wait period after obtaining qualified status before they can enroll. So refugees and those granted asylum are exempt from this wait period, so they are eligible to receive benefits right away. For children and pregnant women, states can opt to eliminate the 5-year wait and extend coverage to lawfully present immigrants. Over half of states have taken up this option for children, and nearly half have elected this option for pregnant women, and this is the case in Wisconsin. And then here you can see data on this graph that shows insurance rates for citizens as of 2016. So lawfully present immigrants are about twice as likely to be uninsured, and then the insurance rate for undocumented immigrants is unsurprisingly much higher. So ACOG doesn't have specific recommendations for asylum seekers, but they do have this committee opinion on healthcare for unauthorized immigrants. So they say that health professionals can play an important role in improving access to needed healthcare for unauthorized immigrants by helping society understand the importance and widespread benefit of universal healthcare access for all U.S. residents, regardless of their immigration status, for advocating for local, state, and government policies and legislations to ensure quality, affordable coverage for all, by advocating for programs that serve unauthorized immigrants, such as increased funding for Title X, supporting the safety net system, providing culturally diverse office atmosphere with interpreters and materials available in languages appropriate to the patient population, and then involvement with ACOG. Many unauthorized immigrants will at some point be detained by U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement in prisons, jails, or ICE detention centers. It's been documented that women, especially pregnant women in immigration detention facilities, have poor access to medical care, and their gender-specific healthcare needs are often neglected. There have been instances of women in detention being denied basic health care, including pregnancy care, treatment of HIV and AIDS, abortion, and feminine hygiene products. Some immigrant women in detention have been forced to give birth while shackled. They're also highly vulnerable to sexual assault. So ICE has published standards related to healthcare during detention, and there's a specific section on women's healthcare. This outlines requirements for reproductive health care, including prenatal care, access to abortion, non-use of restraints for pregnant women and women in labor, preventative services such as STI and cancer screening, and access to contraception. Adherence at specific facilities is well documented. Okay. So switching gears a little bit, physicians can play an important role in helping support an asylum seeker's case for asylum. So this is done by evaluating and documenting human rights abuses in the form of a legal affidavit. So what this looks like practically is that a physician can partner with an attorney to provide a pro bono medical exam for their client. So essentially the clinician performs a targeted history and physical exam. The physical exam is specifically looking for ongoing signs of abuse, so scars, burns, etc., that line up with the applicant's testimony. And there are often not lasting scars from sexual abuse or rape, so this is where the psychological affidavit is really important. There are validated trauma questionnaires that have been developed to assess PTSD, depression, and anxiety, specifically in refugee populations. The physician then summarizes their findings in the form of a legal affidavit and provides expert opinion on the degree to which their findings corroborate the individual's allegations of abuse. They can also provide an assessment for monitoring. So if we go back to this concept of burden of proof, the physician's testimony often becomes a really important factor in helping support the person's claim for asylum. The physician also serves to educate the court system and non-medically trained people on the medical and psychological ramifications of abuse, and then the physician can also assess current treatment needs and place referrals to mental health providers if needed. Asylum is a very arduous legal process, and applicants often face a hostile court system. Unlike in criminal courts, refugees are not innocent until proven guilty. So the burden of proof relies solely on the applicants, and it's dependent upon their own resources to prove their case. So this is why access to pro bono legal and medical services is so critical for these individuals. There was a study done that was looking at asylum grant rates with a medical affidavit. Between 2000 and 2004, healthcare professionals associated with Physicians for Human Rights conducted 1,204 forensic evaluations for individuals seeking asylum in the U.S. Of these cases, 89% were granted asylum compared to the national average of 37.5% during the same time period. The basis of physician evaluations comes from a document called the Istanbul Protocol. This is more formally known as the Manual on Effective Investigation and Documentation of Torture and Other Cruel, Inhumane, or Degrading Treatment or Punishment. So this is really the grounding document that sets forth guidelines for how clinicians should evaluate allegations of abuse. It was written by 75 forensic experts, physicians, psychologists, and lawyers from 15 countries, and it was adopted formally by the United Nations in 1999. It's really the first set of international guidelines for how clinicians should evaluate these allegations. And the expectation is that physicians performing evaluations in the US do so in accordance with Istanbul principles. Okay. So if anyone is interested in becoming an evaluator, you attend a training session through Physicians for Human Rights. So PHR is a major organization in the US that trains clinicians to perform these evaluations. They have a national system that vets cases and then pairs attorneys with local physician evaluators. Usually these are day-long workshops. They provide education related to the asylum process, and they do in-depth training related to recognizing the signs of abuse, drafting medical and psychological evaluations, and working with attorneys. And then if you want to do evaluations, you apply to the PHR Asylum Network, and this is just the national network of clinicians who are trained to perform these evaluations. They also provide resources for mentorship, so typically they'll pair a new applicant with a more experienced applicant locally, and then that person can help with the first cases or be there for anything else that the new evaluator needs. Okay, so where to go from here? Government should embrace policies that support providing refuge to victims of persecution. We need public education that provides an accurate portrayal of refugees and asylum seekers. We need access to comprehensive medical care and health insurance for immigrants. We need to provide medical professionals with greater education in trauma-sensitive, culturally diverse care. Physicians should engage in advocacy at both the local and national level to influence policy and impact legislation. And then I also just wanted to mention the importance of physician self-care and awareness of vicarious trauma when you're dealing really with any patient population who suffered abuses. So if anyone is interested in learning more about this topic, Physicians for Human Rights has some great resources on their website. You can become a physician evaluator. There are currently only 3 PHR-trained evaluators in the state of Wisconsin, and there's certainly a need for clinicians to perform these evaluations. And then, of course, political advocacy. So I just wanted to say thank you to the people who helped me prepare this talk. My references. And I'm happy to take questions.
Okay. Lots of questions. Mary?
Thank you very much. Excellent talk. Raised my awareness of the underserved population that we care for, well, care for shared health. We've never thought about connecting legal services, and we connect in terms of getting insurance because someone falls through the cracks but may have 5 years in the country as a documented immigrant. We have very few that otherwise qualify, and yet we've never come up with the right questions to ask to assess whether or not they may want to be connected to services, seeking asylum or refugee status. So it makes my wheels turn a little bit and how we can better provide for insurance, because that 5-year wait is key. If they're here, we can get them immediate access so that they don't fall through the cracks. I also want to do a shout out in terms of programs that have been long-standing in Wisconsin that care for women irrespective of immigration status, and that is Wisconsin local. They don't care. However, if someone has abnormal cervical cytology or biopsies, those women, unless they're refugees or asylum seekers, don't qualify for Wisconsin Medicaid. But at least Wisconsin local woman does not close the door.
And again, refugees and asylum seekers are not subject to that 5-year wait. And so if you have somebody that is eligible for, asylum status, then, I think there's also just sort of a lack of ability when you come here to even know where to begin in terms of finding services, where to connect with a lawyer, and even how to go about that process.
Yeah, I found this very helpful in terms of, what we as individuals could possibly do. The website, I mean, 3 doctors in the state. How many, do you know how many refugees and asylum seekers we have in the state? Just approximately.
Yeah, so I don't know the data in terms of asylum seekers annually. I tried to get that data and I wasn't able to find it. I can go back to some of the slides from the beginning that talk about sort of over the past, decade and a half or so.
No, it's okay, I was just curious. Yeah, Deb?
Yeah, I thought it was really great. One thing I just wanted to bring up that people might want to Google and learn about is there's a program called the Medical Legal Partnership, which was developed, I believe, in Boston at the EU, which really experimented and found extraordinary value in locating lawyers at healthcare settings. A lot of the folks that we take care of have extraordinary legal issues that interfere with healthcare and all other aspects of life. And they found that a really nice way to hand these folks off to services that they desperately need is to co-locate. So it's done in all sorts of settings. We tried to bring it to our institution. Our legal department was uncomfortable with that. But certainly the FQHCs were successful in co-locating settings. And it just was something for us to think about in our communities.
Great. Saw another hand up here. Yeah.
I was wondering, I know that there was that case, I think around December of the patient seeking abortion, and the court determined that it was a legal right despite them not having access to insurance. I was just wondering if you did any research. I haven't heard much since then on maybe most of the people are in Texas, and so what their access has been like. That patient had gotten a flow towards their services.
And to be honest, I don't know specifically.
Texas is a world of its own. Yes, Brittany.
That was a great talk. Where I trained, I don't know if there's just no people that do this, but I ended up seeing 2 patients for this with no training in how to document this. And it was very challenging.
Yeah.
As I was listening to it, I was like, oh, there is a system. I was just like having them tell me what they needed. They didn't want me to document her mutilation. In particular, they wanted me to say that it was there so she could get asylum, but if she didn't get asylum, they didn't want me to say how bad it was because then she'd get persecuted when she got back. And as someone who had no idea what was happening, I was like, I will do whatever you want me to do, but
So I'm sorry that you were put in that situation without training, because it's PHR doesn't let you do evaluations unless you've gone through pretty extensive training in terms of how to, evaluate and document this and sort of all of the little pitfalls that you can get into legally. But yeah.
What was that in Alabama? I think it's like it happened here.
We have people here who are specifically, similar to the same nurses who are patients who do all this program.
There are 3 people in Wisconsin that are trained through PHR. I'm one of them. I don't know where the other 2 are located. So I can tell you what I found out since I moved here. So when I was in Michigan, in Ann Arbor, I was a part of the student chapter for Physicians for Human Rights. Our mentor was on the board of PHR nationally. And they actually have a phenomenal organization in Detroit called Freedom House that's really a unique program. It's literally a house, and they provide housing and meals for people who are applying for asylum. And they have lawyers there, so they basically, women and men to come in and live in this house and basically are there while their asylum case is pending. And they had a single physician evaluator who was doing all of their cases. So she was doing 3 to 4 a month. And the volume, I don't know if it was just Michigan or Detroit or whatever, was large. So they asked us as a student chapter to sort of step in and train. PHR came in and did some training. So we actually developed a whole kind of network of people based out of the University of Michigan and then in partnership with the law school there who were trained. And it was really remarkable. The volume went up substantially. And we did outreach to local attorneys in the community that were doing these evaluations and basically set up a network, and it was just, the volume just expanded tremendously. No, it's in person. It's in person. So PHR holds annual trainings. There's also an annual training at the University of Michigan every year. So basically you sign up and then you have to go to training. They're in
How long
person.
does it take?
A day. It's a day-long workshop. So in terms of, I don't have a good sense of the population here. So residents can do once you have an unrestricted license. So when I passed my step 3, I applied because I'd already been trained. I've gotten 5 requests in a year and a half. So population, that's not a huge population. Interestingly though, all 5 attorneys were not located in this country. So I got 3 requests from attorneys that were practicing out of the Twin Cities, and then the last 2 were a visiting professor from Chicago who was working with the law school here. So I don't know if there's just not the same, there is a law school like clinic here, but I don't know if there's just not the same kind of infrastructure in terms of the legal system here, or if it's just that the population is less compared to Michigan or the Twin Cities. I don't have a good sense of that, and I haven't been able to get a good sense
Do
of
any
it.
medical students have any ideas about this? Physicians, look it up there, wherever you are. Physicians for human rights, any knowledge what we have here? No, I don't either. Yeah.
Just curious, like, how did they find your name or, like, I guess, how did they know to contact you?
Oh, through PHR. So when you become a trained person, your name goes in this database that tells your address and where you are, and they also do things like, what are you comfortable performing? So I said, of course, that I'm most comfortable doing women's, evaluations for women's health-related things like domestic violence, trafficking, whatever. And then they have a system where attorneys can submit a case to PHR. PHR vets the cases, so they review it to make sure it's legit. And then if they feel like it's a legit claim for asylum, they will email a physician evaluator to say, can you do this evaluation? And if you say yes, then they connect you directly with attorneys. And then from there, you just work with the attorney directly to set up a time and a place for the evaluation. PHR was so overloaded in the last year that they were actually closed to evaluations for quite an extensive period of time. But my first case came directly from PHR, and then the next 2 from just the same law firm, and then my mentor in Chicago referred me for the last 2. So there's a lot of people talk to people.
And where are the options to fly to again? New York and?
The annual training conference varies, the location varies by year. So they hold it in different places at different times. But Michigan is still doing an annual training, typically I think in the fall.
Gary?
Where physically did you go and do these evaluations, just knowing how hard it is to step into?
Yeah, at our Arboretum clinic. Yeah, Dr. Sharp gave me permission.
Good.
Any other questions or thoughts? I thought that was a fantastic talk. Thank you so much. I learned a lot.